Welcome to Old Path and our Monday studies through the Old Testament book of Proverbs. We are at Proverbs 17 today, and when I'm looking at this, I'm remembering that I had said we'll be able to pick up our pace as we go through this, and I'm not really picking up the pace, so we're not taking it on as two chapters at a time, because I just think that there's enough in each one of the chapters, even though we have some repetition, that there's some really practical things that probably shouldn't be rushed through. So hopefully you're not bothered by the pace of this and going through it as we are. Who knows? We still have all the way to chapter 31, so there's a good possibility. There's a couple of chapters that I might just be able to put together, but we're just going to take care of chapter 17 today. Now, I do... Of late, I've been handling kind of apologetic cases and things that people bring up as kind of objections that you see from time to time from people who would disagree with a biblical worldview. And you can tell that they've probably read the same sources, because there's probably about, 10 or 15 of them out there that get thrown out constantly. And we're going to deal with one of those today at the close of the study when we're done with Proverbs. And that is that the God of the Bible, and they'll point it out without really much understanding, they'll point out that the God of the Bible called for genocide. And so that's usually the thing that's thrown out there. And the question is, for us as believers, how do we answer that? Are we able to look at the passages? I mean, do they even know them? So without going too far into that, we'll take that on as we close out today. So for now, let's turn to Proverbs chapter 17, and we will dig into this. It is, again, some really, really good stuff. There is some familiar parts to this, and some themes that he has already approached before and mentioned before. But again, there are some, unique passages in here that I think are really good for us to work through, because remembering this, as we read this, again, we're not the original recipient, and I know that this is kind of review, but we're not the original recipients of the actual letter. We're not even the target audience. The target audience were not considered to be mainly Gentiles 3,500 years down the road. Really, this is written to young men, people that he would refer to as sons, and depending on who you ask, they may very well have been his sons, or a son in particular that he was writing it to, or young men, and it might even change depending on which proverb we're looking at. But it really is written from an older man based on his experience, and he has plenty of it if he's doing this later on, depending on when he was writing it. Each one of the individual ones, at what point in his life he was writing it, he has a lot to draw upon. And again, he's also the king of a nation, and he's been gifted by God early on with a grasp and a mastery, if you will, relative to other humans of knowledge and understanding and wisdom. So God gifted him with that the moment that he asked for it as he was made king. So he's kind of uniquely qualified to talk about these things, but let's make sure that we don't just tune out because, well, it's written by a Jewish king to young men who were also of the tribes of Israel, people who were subject to the law. That is not in any way how we would want to approach this. So if you're a lady, if you're a young woman, or if you're an older man reading this and you've come to faith later in life, trust me, when you read through these, you probably already know this. These are incredibly practical things that are said here, and they have very almost universal application across the board. The places where you might find that doesn't necessarily work out is if you're a young lady or an older woman and you're reading about this and he's talking about picking out a wife or about staying away from the seductress woman. Of course, none of that works across. So you could go ahead and say, but if we were dealing with the genders in reverse, the same principle holds true. So that's why we are able to look in the year 2025, we're at the beginning of 2025, and these are just practical things, observations that are made by Solomon writing to these younger men. And this is probably why there is the repetition, because if they were written at different times, depending on when they were actually assembled, the audience or the group of people and the compilation of them are different because of the recipient. So that's just kind of helpful to us. And again, you can go ahead and read through what people believe about this. When were they written? How were they compiled? There's a lot of discussion on that. And really, we don't have the details. We're not given those details. So when it comes to that, just again, let's read the book as we read it. as a basically a general look at just observations from a man who had a great deal of wisdom and knowledge that was well beyond just what should have been normal to him. He was gifted by God with these things. So that should make, even though he didn't necessarily follow his own advice, nonetheless, what he says is sound. It's a good thing for us to remember as well. Whenever we watch a person who maybe fails at what they're supposed to be as a believer, let's just remember that their failure is not a failure of the Scripture. Their failure is their own. And we all have this in common, that at some point or another, we're always going to fail. We will fall short of what God would expect of us. But that is not a reflection on His Word. That's a reflection on us and our inability to do as He has prescribed us to do. So let's make sure we're really careful about that when we look at these types of things. And as we start to understand what's actually here in the text, even though Solomon was not an exemplary person that we could look at as far as having their life being just like that it's supposed to be, that does not negate the fact that what he says here is biblical, it's practical, it's useful. And if we didn't know his whole backstory, we would never question these things. So let's not taint what he is given here by God to say with the fact that he didn't necessarily always live up to it. Because again, we're all kind of the same way. He just fails more spectacularly because he has much more reach than most of us do. So being the king of a nation really kind of exposes you to a lot of potential folly. And when we get to Ecclesiastes, we'll really get a chance to look through that. So with that being said, we pick up at chapter 17 in Proverbs. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll look at the text. Lord, we thank you so much for the privilege that it is to come before you and to hear from you and what your word would say to us and how we can walk accordingly. We would ask, Lord, that you help us with the part of this that deals with our application to what your word has to say, that we might grow in our knowledge of who you are and how you interact with your people and how we could walk pleasing to you and not falling into the pitfalls of the things that humans tend to do. So, Lord, give us attentive hearts and minds and help us with our understanding of your word. And we give you all thanks and praise in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. In chapter 17 runs 28 verses, and the first one is this. It says, "Better is a dry morsel with quietness than a house full of feasting with strife." Now, what we have here is already something that's been said once before, but and we're going to have a couple of these same types of things. And if you've been following along with us and studying through this book with me, you know that we've had a lot of these kind of things. Even though you might not have much in the material sense, if you have great things in the spiritual sense, it's better to have that than to have great abundance, but in the spiritual sense, you're a mess. And this is one of those types of passages, and there are a number of them throughout Proverbs. And this one gives the idea of more of a feasting kind of a thing, or of the feast, the high holy days. Because the feast that's mentioned here, most look at this as saying, if you're going to be at a time, if you will, of the feast and of the time when Israel would come together. And again, this would only be something that you could say to Jewish men, that you can come together with the feasting, and it may be something that's extravagant, even if it's that idea of the feasts. It would be better to partake just in the quietness of yourself with just a morsel of bread than to enter into the entirety of a feast with a bunch of people who are completely insincere, and in spiritually speaking and in every other way. So it's better is a dry morsel with quietness, and morsel would seem to be more like bread, than a house that is filled of feasting, but yet with strife. And so once again, the difference between the two things is the quietness versus the strife. And quietness is just, again, there's no striving, there's no, there's nothing that a person is struggling to do, whereas strife in the minds of the people can manifest itself in so many different ways. And so it's not as much for us to worry about what does he mean exactly by quietness and what does he mean exactly by strife. The big picture is, once again, that idea of not having necessarily much in the way of material things, but having things right in the spiritual sense, walking rightly before God. That's opposed to the second part of the verse, the people that might be feasting, they may have plenty of everything, and yet nothing is there but strife. And that's the contention. That's the problem. There's always the striving that goes on between people and circumstance and all the rest of it. So we get the picture of this. We live this. We know what it's like to be around people who are always looking for the angle. They're never satisfied. It's always a pursuit of something here or there, as opposed to the person that can be content with what God has provided for them. Verse 2, a wise servant will rule over a son who causes shame and will share an inheritance among the brothers. This is something that Solomon is probably being able to look back and see. And there's an example of it, of the servant Ziba. He was a servant of a man named Mephibosheth. And so you can go back to it. I wrote it down. 2 Samuel 16. And though it's not a direct, straight across kind of a thing here, that David repaid Ziba for what he had done, his kindness and the things that he had done. And though he was a servant, the way that David rewarded him for his faithfulness was maybe even greater than if you had someone who was kind of wayward about a number of things. So if this is said from the sense of a king, if you have an incredibly faithful servant, but you have a son that creates all kinds of problems for you, really you're going to treat that servant on the same level as that child, the one that brings you shame, and he'll be counted among the brothers. And so here's why he says in verse 2, he will share an inheritance among the brothers. So that was Mephibosheth, again, was not his son. He was a son of Jonathan. And you can go back and read the whole story about him. You can just do a search for his name. It's not just here in 2 Samuel, but there's a lot said about him. But again, just that David showed him favor and Ziba favor and people like that to the point where they were able to be seated at his table, which is meaning a way of he brought them in, and they had a place of privilege that others would not ordinarily have outside of family. So verse 3, the refining pot is for silver and the furnace is for gold, but the Lord tests the hearts. This is one of those that, again, this is why we don't really rush right through these. This is super important. There are a number of places that we would look at and say, we get this. So again, the understanding of why would you melt down and why would you use a furnace? Why would you melt gold and silver? And we know the reason for that. It's for the sense of refining. It's for the sense of taking away the impurities. And if you bring something into its liquid state, gold and silver, all of the impurities raise to the top. They're skimmed off if you're going to make them super pure. So they get the picture of that. We get the picture of it. It's easy to understand if you're talking about the refining of things, but it's the way of trying to get rid of the impurities. In that analogy, we have the same kind of a situation as far as God is concerned, that he recognizes the heart. He's the one who refines. He's the one who purifies. And so in the spiritual sense, we all get this. It's not very difficult for us to understand. But here's what's really kind of weird when you start to think about it as far as human nature is concerned. How many times have we heard people talk about following your heart? And, what does your heart tell you and all that kind of stuff? Now, it's fine if we can go ahead, depends on if we're going to define that. We can say that the Lord has really kind of confirmed something in my heart. I was having a decision to deal with, and I went to God's Word. I had counsel from people. I really felt that the Holy Spirit was leading me, and I felt this is a matter of the heart. It's our being. We felt that was God confirming something to us. That's not what's really the concern here. You have other people that would say, and it's worldly counsel, that if you have a decision to make, well, follow your heart. Well, that's kind of the worst option that you could possibly give, because emotions are involved in that, and that can often cloud what your decision should be. And we look at what God says through Jeremiah about the heart being deceitful and wicked above all measure. I think it's Jeremiah 19. It's wicked and it's deceitful above all measure, and who can know it? And it's there where God says, but I'm the one who knows the heart, and I try the reins of it. So for us in our counsel and the way that we would look at this, following our heart's probably the worst possible advice that we could give. It sounds great, sounds wonderful, it sounds all high-minded, but it is just horrible counsel. So this idea, it's really ultimately God who genuinely knows. As we look at it, nobody knows us better than ourselves. Well, God knows us better than even that, because there's always going to be, if you will, with us, kind of a thumb on the scale or things that we could do that would really cloud our judgment. God has no such limitations. So that idea that God is the one who takes a look at the heart, he's the one who knows all the ins and outs of it, even to the smallest of detail. So verse 4, an evildoer gives heed to false lips. A liar listens eagerly to a spiteful tongue. Again, an observation about how people do what they do. And so there's ways that you look at this, and like in the first part of this, you could almost reverse it. Let me show you what I mean. An evildoer gives heed to false lips, or false lips are going to produce evil doings. And so this is easy to see. It's one follows the other. It's just kind of the way that they all are going to operate as far as the world is concerned, or as far as their life is concerned. A person who produces evil is going to want to listen to false, to lies, and to all the rest of it. They're just going to, kind of birds of a feather, they're going to flock together. We get this. It's just an observation. And so it goes on. It says, now a liar will listen eagerly to a spiteful tongue. Why? Well, because they themselves are liars. They're not going to have a problem of listening to other liars. They just kind of gravitate towards one another, and they buy into the same nonsense. So verse 5, he who mocks the poor reproaches his maker, and he is glad at calamity. He who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. Observationally, once again, people that believe in the idea of karma would love to point to this one here as one of those types of passages. Now, there are things that God says in the Word that, reaping and sowing, that if a person does a particular thing, they can expect a particular outcome. The people that believe in karma would say that then Christians and the people in the Bible believe the same things. The big difference between those two things is that karma, as they would talk about it, is really not based upon any kind of a person. It's just a universal kind of a rule, and it's the universe who decides. But the universe is not anything that's ever communicated to us. And as far as they're concerned, karma is really kind of something that's almost fickle, capricious. You never really know for sure. But when God says reaping and sowing and all the rest of that, he's the one who lays out what is and what is not acceptable. So if there's going to be a particular outcome, it's because God has said there would be an outcome for a particular action. So if we consider it like that, the one who mocks the poor reproaches his maker. So if you're going to look at somebody in their calamity and in their trouble and in their poverty and mock them, ridicule them, make fun of the whole thing, then you taking a shot at those people as though you're doing the same towards God. You're mocking his creation, that person who's there. And again, it speaks a lot about the heart of the person, because rather you should look upon them with compassion. Now, there are some times that you will see people who have brought themselves to poverty through their own, foolishness. And, you can still take compassion on them and recognize at the same time that they brought it on themselves. But that doesn't mean you walk away from them, mocking them and making fun of them. What you would hope is that you have an opportunity to preach the good news to them. In our modern times, we would love to tell people that. So going on, and he who is glad at the calamity, more than likely related to the first part of this, the person that's brought to poverty, maybe by some calamity, the person who is glad at calamity will not go unpunished. It's going to come back on them. So that's the idea that you can think of karma. But if God is the one who's being mocked here, as Solomon would see it, and wanting to say to the young man, don't be like these people. Don't be like the type that would look at the poor and just look at them with disdain and mock them, and then ultimately have pleasure in whatever it is that creates that kind of a condition, because it'll come back on them. God will not honor who those people are. That's the point. And that's how Solomon would see it. And yet, if you think about it, through the history of Israel, you had those people who became very powerful, and they did exploit those who were under them. Now, that's not because God wanted it that way. That was when the nation was at those times, usually in great rebellion. And so the whole nation had really kind of gone that way, and God had let them have what it is that they wanted. But in a perfect world, as Solomon would see it, for a nation that is walking rightly before God, and he's on the throne, if you will, over the country, those type of people would be seen, and they would be, first of all, at that place, they would be in violation of the law, and they would have to pay the penalty of the law for their actions. In a perfect world, that's how it ought to be, though through their history, that was usually not the case. What was right and what was honorable was never really followed, and so the nation itself was in a place of complete waywardness. Now, it says, children's children are a crown of old men, and the glory of children is their father. Now, this again assumes that everything is as it ought to be among the older and the younger, in a place where it's a godly family, living a godly life, and they are governed in a righteous way by God and by his law, then this all works out. So if you want to look at a man and say, that man's been blessed, his glory, how do you know that? Look at his family. Look at the ones who are there in his generations, his children, his children's children. And by the opposite, the children would look up to the grandfather in this case, or the elder, and look at them. So this is, again, for the mother the same way, for the grandmother, for the great-grandmother, whatever that may be. If they are right and honorable people before God, they should be, since the family would be following the Lord, the children would look up to them as these great examples, these ones who have gone on for all of these years, for these decades, if you will, walking rightly and honorably. This is how it ought to be in a household where God is honored. It should be from top to bottom, from the oldest to the youngest. There should be both ways. The husband or the father, the grandfather and grandmother, this works again with them, would look down through their generations and be pleased with what they see, and then it would work in the opposite, from the younger looking to the older. So verse 7, excellent speech is not becoming a fool, much less lying lips to a prince. And so it's the things that would just kind of be, they're out of place. So if this is excellent speech, or those things that are good and equitable and high and lofty and wonderful, these good things, these excellent things of speech, they don't become a fool. Fools do not say these things, and if they were to, it's completely disingenuous. And the fool would maybe be doing it for some reason that's of benefit to them. But again, it's unseeming, it's unbecoming of them. It doesn't work, it doesn't fit. It's out of place. And then the second part of that, much less lying lips to a prince. So a prince should never be found in the place of being a liar. And this is, again, if we're thinking prince in the most common usage, this would be somebody like one of Solomon's youngers and one of the people of the family, one of the people that are there of the nobles, the princes. Those people should never be in the place of being dishonest and of lying and all the rest. They're supposed to be the people tasked with leading a nation. So, verse 8, a present is a precious stone in the eyes of its possessor, and wherever he turns, he prospers. Now, this sounds really positive here, but there are many who believe that this is more written satirically, looking at the Hebrew, and what it would basically be is that the precious stone, or the thing that is of great, great value. First of all, the big question that comes up, the one who possesses it, is it the one who possesses it before it's given as a present, or is it the person who receives the present? And so you find people will argue about that whole thing. And then what does it mean after that part? And is it a sure thing that whatever this gift is going to lead to prosperity? And why they think it's parody, or not parody, but it's kind of kind of satirical, is the way that people will view such things. And again, the language kind of allows for this, that whatever it is that somebody has as a possession, if that is the focus of them, if it is that possession that is of great importance to them, it's going to dictate what they do going forward, and their prosperity as they see it really may be ultimately what brings their ruin. So I guess if you're trying to say, what's the takeaway from this? Those things that you put great value in, if you put great value in things that have no business having great value put in them because they're yours, they're your possession, and you really occupy your time trying to maintain or keep or use, they're going to send to you where you think is something that's prosperous, but there's no promise to that. Again, would God honor something where a person puts so much stock in something that is a possession? That's why they see it as kind of satirical. Now, if that's not the intention of the whole thing, if the gift is something that is wonderful and good and useful and godly, if you will, and a person uses it for such reasons, then you could say, yeah, well, God would honor that. He'd prosper it. But again, most of the guys smarter than I have looked at this and thought it's really kind of more of the idea in satire that a person will put such great value in earthly things, and that will lead to him just following those things and not necessarily where God would be leading. So, verse 9, he who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. Boy, have we watched this one happen over and over again. We watch it. It's kind of a human nature thing. A person may have somebody come against them and do something. It's transgression. And so they're going to kind of keep that to themselves. It's better to just kind of leave it alone. There's nothing that can be done about it. No sense in making it a big case, because it's just going to lead to more problems and more people are defiled by it, rather than just the person the perpetrator and the person who is a victim. So rather than retaliate, I'm just going to keep this to myself, as opposed to the one who repeats a matter separates friends. Look what that person has done to me. They're such horrible people. And it's a truism as far as humans are concerned. When you're telling somebody about something that was done to you, and you were the one that was personally harmed, you're a lot of times going to tell that story, and the more it's repeated, the more grand it may very well become. Now, you were wrong, there's no question about it, but of course, if we're going to try to make the person who did this the bad guy, you're going to tell the story in a way that really emphasizes the point that that's a bad guy. So the idea that it could even come between friends, because it means that it's somebody who everyone knows. And so that case, again, he's being very general here, because it's intended to just be said in the most universal kind of a way, or the big picture kind of a way. And the person reading this would be able to understand, here's the principle that I'm being told. I may have somebody who wrongs me, but trying to retaliate against them, and one of the best ways to do it is to make it all known. And something that could easily just be left alone could become so contentious that it begins to divide friendships. And so this is the discretion to the person hearing it. Is it best for me to keep this to myself? Or is it better for me to go ahead and put them on blast and let everybody know about it and then see where the chips fall, but I'm going to get my pound of flesh? Verse 10, rebuke is more effective for a wise man than 100 blows on a fool. This is pretty obvious. So where will you get farther with the person who is wise as opposed to the person who is the fool? The fool's never going to be turned away from what they're doing in their foolishness, even if it comes at the expense of them being punished for what they've done. Sorry. But as far as the wise man, you'll be able to say to them, here's what you've done, and here's the bottom line to it. Here's the effect of it. That's the rebuke. What you've done is wrong. The wise person is going to hear that and say, I've done what you said is wrong, and they'll take that correction and they'll act accordingly. The fool, you could beat them 100 times and it's not going to change it. They won't change their course. That's kind of the nature of being a fool. In verse 11, an evil man seeks only rebellion, or that's sin, transgression. A person that's evil, that's just going to be the thing that they will pursue after. Therefore, a cruel messenger will be sent to him. Once again, that idea of karma. But in a nation operating the way that it's supposed to, God does not turn a blind eye to that kind of sin. And if you remember that, the second time that the law was given after the first tablets were broken, when Moses had God say to him who he is, and he talks about him as his character, that he is compassionate, that he is merciful, and all those things, and that he will forgive sin and iniquity, but he will not ignore transgression. He doesn't let it go by. It's not something where he's, okay, no big deal. It's like there's an accounting of those things. And so as far as God is concerned, a person who does so wickedly in that open rebellion against God's law, it will not go unnoticed, and that person will have to deal with the consequences of it. Now again, Solomon could say this assuming that the hearer and that the nation itself is walking in accordance with the law. The law would dictate that it goes this way. And yet we see so often in Israel's history when the nation pretty much as a whole completely ignored God and went into all kinds of idolatry and wickedness, that God withdrew himself from them. They were not governed by his law. So let's remember when we're reading these things, if we could say, yeah, but there's so many examples where they didn't do that. True. This is said to people who would be in a right place as far as God is concerned and being governed by him. Then it would be God who would recompense those things. It would be the Lord who would see that injustice was dealt with in a just manner. Instead, they would leave it to themselves, and we see the carnage that would happen from that. So, I love this one. Let a man meet a bear robbed of her cubs rather than a fool in the midst of his folly. This is one of those passages that it's just like, He says some really funny stuff, and this is one of those things. What would be the better thing is to walk up on a mother bear with cubs. We know what happens with that. You get completely mauled and killed. And it says it would be a preferable outcome to do that than to engage with a fool in the midst of his folly, and you're going to get swept up with it. And there's a really interesting thing when you think about, if you were able to probe him a little bit more on this, or if we were to use this proverb and say, it would be better that you walked up on a wild animal between her and her cubs, because the worst that's going to happen to you is that she's going to take offense to that and you're going to be dead. She's going to wipe you out. But if you're going to be a person who stumbles upon a foolish person and you engage in that foolishness, in a spiritual sense, that's an eternal problem. The worst that happens to you with the mama bear is that you die here in the physical sense, but it's not an eternal consequence. But involved in a fool and his folly and getting swept up in it, it has a much greater eternal consequence to it. But it's pretty, the visual is pretty funny, actually. Verse 13, whoever rewards evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. This is very similar to other ones we've even seen in this chapter. So it's what a person will pursue after is going to end up coming back to find them. So as he says, whoever regards evil for good, and we think of what Isaiah talks about with this, of the nation when they were in rebellion. These are people who called good evil and evil good. Same kind of a situation here, is that a person who will do such a thing, whoever rewards evil for good, evil will not depart from his house. This will be his whole life. That's what he's going to have to deal with for the rest of his existence, unless repenting. And of course, that's the caveat. But you can see wickedness follows wickedness, and whatever they're doing that is evil and wicked, it's going to come to their home. They won't be able to escape it. It's what they participate in. Now, the beginning of strife is like a release of water. Therefore, stop contention before a quarrel starts. We get this. This is the idea of being something that's just a little bit of a leak of water as opposed to a torrent. And the way that you stop it is if it begins, don't keep doing the same thing because you'll get more of it. So stop it while it's just a drip before it becomes a torrent and the dam bursts, if you will, and then it's a raging flood. So it makes perfect sense. Just this is so easily practical. And contention is the contention and quarrel. That's the thing. If you're seeing people in an argument and disagreement and arguing and really kind of even the step above that is to try to start to damage one another through words and making your own factions and all the rest. That's what comes from it. That's the quarrel is the leak. The factions and the contention and the damage that you do is the torrent that comes after. Don't let it get from one to the next. Verse 15, he who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the just, both of them alike are an abomination. And abominations before the Lord are things that he looks upon and he says, these are detestable to me. I disdain the resulting effect of these things. So what are those? The one who justifies the wicked, sees a person doing wicked things and makes excuses for it. The one who justifies the wicked, and the one who condemns the just, who will see a person who does all the right things and find reason for condemnation, probably out of conviction because they don't measure up and these people are, an offense to them. So again, these are things that God would look upon and say, I detest that kind of a heart and what goes on and really what comes of it. So what are those things again? The one who justifies the wicked, makes excuses and approves of it, and the person who will try to make a case against the person who is just in God's sight. Remember, it's the Lord who is the one who determines all of these. Good, evil, just, unjust, whatever the case may be. When you have examples on either extreme, it's not according to man, but it's according to what God would see. He's the one who determines because he's the only one who genuinely knows. So, verse 16. Why is there in the hand of a fool the purchase price of wisdom, since he has no heart for it? This is just a great way of looking at this and saying, wisdom is something that really is ultimately available to anyone. Even the person who will not bow the knee to God, at some point, they are able to make a determination of what God has said and act accordingly. And here Solomon's just kind of this observation. It's like, everybody has this capacity, but the fools don't even care about this. And yet God still allows them or affords them the ability to have all the same resource that everyone else does. And he finds this to be, from the way that it looks, just kind of a fascination. And I put it, it's kind of like that whole thing with Asaph, is that he goes, I watched the prosperity of the wicked, when he says this in Psalms. And he said, and it was almost too awful for me to kind of come to grips with how evil people get to do evil things. And they seemingly get away with it. And then he says, but then I went into the house of the Lord and I considered their end. That was his point of just being able to say, yeah, all that stuff is temporary. And they get away with it here and now, but when he looks at, and when he goes into the house of the Lord, he realizes, yeah, but there's an eternity, and those people are going to be excluded from an eternity with him. Their eternity is going to be excluded from him, and there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Here, Solomon, if this is what we understand of that, and this was his intent, is to say every man has the capacity to do wisely and walk rightly before God, but so many people have that, and they don't find any worth or any value in it. To him, it's kind of a paradox. How weird is this that people don't see it? So there's a lot of applications to that. And I've used this one a number of times. Some of us got saved, I'm not one of them, but got saved at places where a lot of people got saved at the same time. Crusades, maybe church service where an altar call was given, or whatever you want to call it. Wherever it may be, there may have been a lot of people who were there when you came to faith. And yet there were people that sat in the seats. They heard exactly the same message. Everything was the exact same. They sat right next to you, but they had a completely different reaction. Why is it that they had a different reaction? And again, we understand what that is. It's the matter of the heart. It's that a person sees their need for it. In this case, like there's a wealth that everyone has, and yet only some avail themselves to it. Kind of the same principle that you see here. And it says in this, verse 17, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. Now, this idea of a friend loves at all times, it means through thick and thin, no matter the circumstance. A friend will love a friend no matter what's going on around. And it says, and a step above that, and a brother is born for adversity. They're more than a friend. And that may be the same person, but they just move from that place of just friendship because they're there for all of those things, and then there becomes that fellowship between them. It's as close as a brother or a sister, and they are there through thick and thin. No matter what comes, they will always be there. And what a neat thing that is. Once again, in the New Testament sense, and Solomon couldn't have possibly understood this, but think about this, that when we start to think about the relationship that we have to God the Father through the Son, we're referred to as ones who inherit the kingdom. We're co-heirs of the kingdom. That puts us in the sense of brothers. And when it comes to the person of Jesus, brothers and sisters, if you will. Now again, it doesn't mean that we're gods. It doesn't mean that we're anything like him in the sense of who he is in his essence. But the relationship that he has secured for us at the cross brings us into that place where we're considered the children of God. So that's, that amazing relationship, that being sons and daughters of the King. Mind-blowing how wonderful the truth that is. So if we think about it like that, that is the relationship that we have even with the Lord himself, that we would say he's one who sticks closer. He's one who will be there as a brother, and one who will be right there with us. It's just an amazing, amazing thing. Verse 18, a man devoid of understanding shakes hands in a pledge and becomes surety for his friend. Now we've seen this one before, and how it's just not a great thing to do. And the lack of understanding means you're not paying attention to the idea that you're basically signing on the line as a co-signer. Or you've obligated yourself to say, on behalf of this person here, whatever they may do, I will back whatever it is. And so this really kind of is an indictment on kind of human nature. The idea that you would obligate yourself to someone else's debt, and they've put themselves in that place to begin with. Now, there are those circumstances where you could say it's a little bit different. Not every circumstance is the same way. But if a person just, I'll be there for you no matter what, well, they may have gotten themselves into that place because of just bad decision making. But you saying, I'll back their play, it's easy for them to just step away from it, and then you're left holding the bag. As Solomon would put that shows a lack of understanding, and you're really not supposed to do that according to the law. So, a man who's devoid of it, it's just not present of understanding, he will shake hands in a pledge. Sure, I'll back whatever you need. You tell me what you need. And becomes surety for his friend. You're obligated to everything that handshake causes. So, verse 19, he who is in love with or loves transgression also loves strife. It's all the contention. It's the backbiting. It's the arguing. It's all of the fighting and all the things that come along with it. And he who exalts his gate seeks destruction. The idea of his gate more than likely just means whatever it is that he has in his possession, thinking more of his home, the things that pertain to him. And if that's your whole pursuit, eventually it comes to nothing. Because again, you're the one who's trying to earn those things and build them for yourselves, independent of what God may or may not want. Whether or not he's obviously not even going to be involved in the process. Will God honor such a thing where a person is trying to build their own things independent of him? So that's why it says that he who loves transgression loves strife. So this person who's trying to build their own thing, this speaks about them. This is a person who loves to be in a place of transgression and of strife. And the transgression is, of course, of sin and not walking rightly before God. And then, of course, the strife is all the things that come with it: the contention, the arguing, all the stuff and the back and forth between people. Meanwhile, you turn on just trying to, from that point of that being the constant state of your life, trying to build your own empire, your own home, everything that you have, but yet destruction is going to be ruin comes from all of those things ultimately. So it says, now he who has a deceitful heart finds no good. Now deceitful, again, that's the idea of being crooked, and it's being wrong. It's deceit. It's guile. It's trying to scheme for things and in a dishonest sense. So he who has a deceitful heart finds no good, and he who has a perverse tongue falls into evil. Easy observation. If that's your course of life, everything that's going to be antithetical to what God would ask you to do, there's a reward to those things. And they know it as we should know it as well. That's the idea of sowing to the flesh and reaping of the flesh corruption. So that's a New Testament sense, but it's kind of the same thing. Whatever person is going to consume themselves with pursuing, they're going to get the fruit of that. And in this case, it's destruction. So, verse 21, he who begets a scoffer does so to his sorrow, and the father of a fool has no joy. And so again, we understand what this is. This is about the parents and the children. And again, this is something that I think it's important for us to remember as well. The family should be something that we care greatly about. And if we're the younger person in that, and we want to be pleasing as far as God is concerned and the family, because remember, in his time, those two things were not mutually exclusive. A home should have been built upon the principle of God's law and God's word. They would have been faithful to keeping the law and the things that they were supposed to do. And so as far as a family was concerned, those who walked rightly and honorably before the Lord, keeping his law and walking in accordance with it, there is a blessing that comes along with it. If you have someone in the family who goes completely against that, that's going to become a problem for the parent. Now, we can see this in the secular sense, but it has a whole different dimension to the spiritual side of things. Because frankly, on the secular side of things, we almost expect those things. If people are not going to be pursuing after the things of God, they are then their own authority. They're going to live whatever code of morality and what they think is right and wrong in their own eyes. So if the kids go sideways, there's really never been a standard. The parents are the standard, or the family larger part is the standard. But it's easy to see that kind of goes on a downward slope, because that's going to degrade over time. The only thing that's constant is that when God says, this is what is and is not acceptable to me, that's unchangeable. So people who would be subject to that are going to walk accordingly. Now, if you have a family who is saying we're obedient to God's word, putting it into our time, there's so much more that we know about God and what is and is not acceptable to him than Solomon could have. We have all of that in writing. And God has said, want to walk rightly and honorably before me? You want there to be right fellowship with us? Here are the terms. We can see that and say, great, this is how our family will walk before the Lord, and this is how we are going to conduct ourselves. Somebody in the family steps outside of that line and does so in rebellion, that's going to be a reflection on the family, and it's going to be grief to the parents. That's what's being spoken of here. And we see it all the time. The one who begets a scoffer, a fool, someone who just mocks and ridicules what it is that they believe, does so to his sorrow. that person is going to be a reflection on the parent and create great grief and sorrow for them. And the father of a fool has no joy. I don't look at my kid at that point. I wouldn't look at my kid and think, oh, I'm so happy with them. And yet, this is a sad thing. And I know maybe even some of you hearing me, this is really, really troublesome for you. But we find our kids, and I see so many of my friends over the years, watch their kids go into complete, total rebellion. And yet it's almost like at times they don't lay down the law and basically say, sorry, I love you, but I cannot in any way participate with the things that you're doing. What you're doing is unfaithful to as far as God is concerned, and I can't have it in my house. I'll always be here. I'll always love you. I'll help pick up the pieces when you come back to your right mind in this, but I can't participate in the things that you're doing, realizing that it has a disastrous eternal outcome. I know it's a very difficult thing for some people, but the idea that we want to love our kids, we do, but we want to love our kids based upon a standard, and that standard is God's word. And what does he have to say about whatever they might be into, and what should we be as far as our participation? How much of it do we condone by not stepping in front of it? Interesting way of, again, that there's only one way, because it's all hypothetical, until you're in the midst of the whole situation. How would you conduct yourself? Ultimately, you have to do what the word tells you to do if you want God's involvement in the whole thing. Very, very difficult times. I know many people have struggled with that. Verse 22, a merry heart does good like medicine. That happiness, the merriment of heart. That means that things are right as far as the world is concerned. It's right as far as our life is concerned. And it's like medicine. But a broken spirit dries the bones. It has such a detrimental effect on every aspect of your life. And again, we've all watched this. If things are really, really good in life, it just permeates everything about your whole existence. As opposed to when things go completely sour, it just has such a direct effect on the human that's experiencing those things. They have a genuine effect on the well-being of the person. So it says in verse 23, a wicked man accepts a bribe behind the back. Now, the wording of this almost gives the impression that it's something of even the raiment that a person would wear. That if a bribe is to be given, you don't want it out there for everyone to be able to see. And there's some who believe that what's being said here is that people would walk around with, pockets or even purses, things where something could be. And if a bribe was just put into someone's pocket, everybody can see it. But this is that idea that there would be a compartment or something in the back that you'd be able to put something, and only the person receiving it would understand. But really the bigger point to this, whether it's that descript or not, the idea that it's done in secret. Someone who will receive a bribe, it's done in secret because there's a reason why. You don't want people to know, and you're doing it because you desire an outcome from the person to whom you're giving the bribe, who is able to make good on what that is. A wicked man accepts the bribe. It's, of course, the person offering it is just as wicked, does so behind the back, and it's for this reason, to pervert the ways of justice. And so this is something that the law hates these things. The law talks about this because, again, it's not having things being equitable. It's because a person has the means to do it, will buy the influence of someone else to their benefit, and in the process to the detriment of someone else. God had a real problem with those kinds of things. Wisdom is in the sight of him who has understanding. It means like it's in view. So wisdom, for a person with understanding, walking as God would instruct to them, the thing that is in their view is wisdom, because that's the end goal. That's what we want to see. There's a direction. That's what we pursue after. And wisdom would be, how do I walk rightly before God? How do I do the things I'm supposed to do? What I know about God's character, that's what helps me to know. The pursuit of it is wisdom, because that's the beginning of my relationship with the Lord, walking rightly before him. That's always in my view. That's what's here. And that's the vision that's being, or the visual that's being put here. Now, the opposite of that is the eyes of a fool. They're on to the ends of the earth. They're not looking at anything in particular. They're not focused on anything. It's just everything's out in front of them. There's no direction. There's no focus. So then in verse 25, similar to what we've already seen before, a foolish son is a grief to his father and bitterness to her who bore him. So if this is a man writing to a younger man, there's several times we've already seen it in this. that younger person can bring shame upon the family by their actions. And here's the first time where he mentions that it's not just the father, but the mother, at least in this chapter. This is said specifically of both of the parents, the father and the mother, are going to be brought to a place of just hurt and harm, physically, mentally, spiritually. All those things could be a possibility just by the actions of their child. So this would be something for the younger person to hear, that when they get old, they would have that understanding. You don't want this done to you when you're that age, but at the same time, it's supposed to keep them on the straight and narrow. Don't do this to your parents. In a godly sense, why would they ever want to? So, again, if they understand the law, they would know that you're not supposed to do that. Verse 26, also, to punish the righteous is not good, nor to strike the princes for their uprightness. This is the idea of doing what's right based upon what's there. The law would tell you that a person that is righteous would never have to worry about any kind of punishment, or a person who walks in uprightness would never have to suffer any kind of consequence for that uprightness. But yet we would see that all the time. It's the righteous who are persecuted when the things go the way that they're not supposed to. And so again, if the people who are in power have the ability to oppress the righteous, they will do so. And we've seen it throughout history. Again, remember, this is also here of a king speaking to sons, and they would be the next one in the line of that thing. At least princes, maybe kings down the road. So the idea that a nation should be pursuing the Lord as a whole, and you would never have these kind of things. The oppression of the righteous would never be the issue. Actually, it would be the righteous who would be overseeing a nation and trying to make sure that as best as they can to keep any kind of wickedness out from among the people. So you can see how this, again, we don't have to make a whole lot of statements on this, but you see how this works in every country that there is on the planet to some extent. The more wicked the leadership, the more it's going to oppress its righteous inhabitants of the nation, especially in the spiritual sense. So, verse 27, he who has knowledge spares his words, and a man of understanding is of a calm spirit. Again, we've seen this play out all the time. The one who has knowledge, you're just not going to say the first thing that's on your mind. And again, how often have we done this? We might say something and go, gosh, if I had that to do over, I wouldn't have said that. The idea that you would want to keep your words and what you divulge, it's best that you really think seriously and carefully before you utter a word, not saying the first thing that comes to mind. And a man of understanding is of a calm spirit, not reactionary. Something that was said, they're not easily provoked in saying the first thing that's on their mind. So again, this kind of gives the impression that there's something that is stirring up enough that it would be very easy to just say the first thing on your mind. Another person would say, though I'm provoked, I'm going to consider this before I have a word to say, because it might turn out that a quick answer is not going to give the desired effect. In fact, it'll make problems worse. And then the last one, verse 28, even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace, and when he shuts his lips, he is considered perceptive. So these two things that are mentioned here, the idea of holding your peace, not having to give your cause, not having to give your defense, not having to just defend yourself or whatever else it may be, saying the whole of whatever's on your mind. The second part of this, the idea of the one who shuts his lips along the same lines. Even a fool can do those things. And that's the point, is that these things are so universal and they're so important that even a fool could do these things. They don't usually, but they're of such a quality, and they're of such a way that they're immovable. They're always going to be. The idea of silence and not just saying the first thing and not starting a quarrel, that is always going to be the ideal. That's how it should be at all times with all people. And even once in a while, a fool can even do these things. It doesn't mean, what it means is that they can be done by anyone. It's not as though they're only for the adept, or that you have to go through some rigorous training in order to understand the difference and then act accordingly. That they're plentiful. The idea of holding your peace and not just being the first person to say anything at any time, even fools can understand that. And again, here's where they would be able to put that in practice. If the things that they say might put them in instant peril, even they will know, probably not better that I talk now. Doesn't mean they don't want to, doesn't mean that they won't down the road, but even from time to time, they may hold their peace because they're going to think about the consequences of what they say. Really, really interesting. This is, again, such practical, easy to follow, easy to understand passages that are here. And again, they're so practical for us here and now. Best for us to remember the original recipient and the intended audience at the time, and yet we see that universally they fit very, very well. So we'll pick up at Proverbs 18 next week. And I want to address something that we hear all the time. Again, it's one of those things that's being brought up now because of what's happening in Israel and the things that are going on in Gaza. So you can see it. Some people have learned a new word in English called genocide. They have no idea what it means. And yet that's the same kind of accusation that we'll hear from the scoffers against what the Bible teaches about many things. And usually it's this way. We might be talking to somebody and we're wanting to witness to them about the goodness of God and about his love for them and their need for his forgiveness. Any of those kind of things might just be in the discussion. Maybe some of you, as you're hearing me, have had this go on. And the reply that you'll get from those people was, well, you want me to believe in your God who's not loving. He's actually called for the genocide of people. It's right there in the Bible. He's a bloody God who is telling them to go and conquer and kill everyone. So, how do you answer the question? How is it that we deal with that? There are a few different ways. And again, I didn't use any particular passage because you can find so much of it from before they even entered into the land when Moses was still alive. So Deuteronomy 9 is a great example of this. And he's telling them, when you get into the land, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I need you to drive them out. And if driving them out means that they don't go out of the territory by themselves, if you can't get to them, but they displace themselves, you're not going to go pursue after them. It's about the cleansing of the land. But if they're still going to remain in the land, there's a couple of things that he's concerned about. Actually, some movable parts here. But let's deal with, before I get into that, let me deal with one other thing. You'll notice that the only time when God has ever told them to go to war, and that they're going to go to war against a particular people and not to let any of them survive, there's a reason why that's the case. But you'll notice it's not universal. He didn't tell Abraham to do this. By Jesus' time, they weren't told to take up arms against the Romans and kill them all. They weren't ever told to do that other than when they were first coming into the land. So when they first came into the land after the Exodus and they came into the territory, God had already promised that land to them all the way back at Abraham's time, and it's 500 years after that initial promise. Now here they come into the land. So with all that being said, they come into the land and God is knowing a few different things. So that's why we want to make sure. Here's one of those things. A lot of times people have such a problem with this, and we want to be really careful when we say it because we want to make sure that there's a lot of follow-on discussion. When someone will say, well, the Bible says that they were to go and kill them all, we want to be able to say this, and I know it sounds like just such an escape word. Well, you're taking that out of context. I don't necessarily say it quite that way because that's just them. They're going to roll their eyes. Oh, great, another one of those. It's not in the context. I'll want to say it this way. Well, if you understand the context of what he said, let me explain it to you why he decided to do it that way or why he was doing it that particular way. And here's the basic layout of that. Why would he do that when they're coming into the land, but not at other times? Because it's certainly not universal. As far as the church is today, and this is why I want to point out to them, do you realize, I'll say this to the scoffer, do you want to realize this? Nowhere in the New Testament are we asked to do anything of the sort. Nothing like that. We're not supposed to make war with the authorities around us. We're not supposed to do any of those kind of things. So if God isn't asking the church to do it, but yet we can look at the passages like Deuteronomy 9 or so many others all the way up to Joshua, where they were told to make war against a particular group of people and make sure that they didn't remain. What's the difference between those two things? So here's the things that we need to answer when it comes to that. First of all, they are coming into a land. And in the time of their displacement and their slavery in Egypt, the entirety of the land of Israel, modern day, and where they would be going into, was completely taken over by pagan people, sacrificing, worshiping other gods, and all the rest of it. By the time that they've come into the land, here's what we know as far as God is concerned. They are already judged as far as God is concerned. He has condemned those people because of their wickedness. There's no saving those people. So his concern is, first of all, I'm going to use you as my hand of judgment on those people, but I also need them to be out of the territory so that they don't corrupt you in the same things that they are doing. Better for them to be lost than for them and you as well. And that was the reason why. Now, again, we can look through their history and they didn't do those things. And a lot of times they didn't, and they were corrupted in the exact same way. And so when God brought them into the land, his desire was purge the land of the people who I have already judged, who are distant from me and are provoking me by serving other gods. Those people, in his righteous estimation, were to be judged, and he was using Israel as his hand of judgment upon them as he was making good on a promise to bring them back to the land. But again, it was for that specific time, and it's very, very specific to a particular amount of time and a particular group of people, and we can see why God wanted it done in the way it played out in the nation. They didn't purge the people that they were supposed to the fullest extent, and those people, by remaining in the land, corrupted the people who were there, and idolatry and wickedness came into the nation. Look at all the things that ended up happening to that country that never should have been able to happen. They never should have fallen to the Assyrians in the north. They never should have fallen to the Babylonians in the south. None of that should have ever happened if they had walked rightly before God. But they didn't do as they were asked to do in a number of different ways, beginning with the idea that they didn't purge the land of the people who were doing what they were doing as a direct provocation to God, to the point where the children of Israel were sacrificing their children as the people of the land were doing. So God had said to them, purge the land. That was for that time, and it was not for after that. That was supposed to be as they come into the land and subdue it, and that was supposed to be the end of it. Never worked out for them. They were not obedient. God wasn't asking them to do that before. He didn't ask them to do it after. He doesn't ask us to do it now in the church. So when people want to say that, well, God called for genocide, I'll first of all ask, you want to show me where that is? And then I'm going to see if they know anything about anything, or if they're just repeating the same thing that they've heard so many times before. And if they do have an example for me, great. I'm glad that you've brought that up. Now let me explain where that took place, and then I'll ask the questions. Did he ask them to do it before? Did he ask them to do it after? Does he ask us to do it here and now in the church? And of course, they're going to have to answer no to that. So what was different about that time gives us the opportunity to really spend some time in the Word and explain something through to its conclusion. So, which is what we always want to do in the sense of apologetics, is to give an answer for what it is that we believe, and explaining to them this defense. Here is what it means. Not being defensive, but giving an answer to a question, or really more to an objection that they're not used to getting an answer to. I want to answer objections all the way through to the end, so that they walk away with one of two things. I didn't know that, or at least they cannot plead ignorance, because someday they'll stand before God, and if they use that as the excuse for not coming to him, he will remind them that somebody showed them the truth and they ignored it. So, really important stuff. We pick up at Proverbs 18 next week, and I look forward to sharing that with you.